Hi everyone, welcome back to another video, or welcome if you're new to my channel. Today we're doing another true crime case. Have you seen Psycho or Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Silence of the Lambs? If you haven't seen any of these, I'm sure you've heard of them. Well, this man was the influence behind the characters from these movies. He inspired Norman Bates in Psycho and Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. There's also a Netflix docuseries, I think you'd call it, at the moment about this man, and that is Ed Gein. The Netflix show has been dramatized, and there are lots of speculative bits of added information in there. So this is the real story of Edward Gein, which is horrifying enough as it is. So sit back and relax, and let's dive into the inspiration behind some of Hollywood's most famous villains. Edward he was socially awkward and often bullied, and I think his mum was like his only safe place, his only person he could really be himself with and feel somewhat liked or loved. He displayed facial asymmetry, and I think that, you know, played a big part in the bullying side of things, as well as just being a bit socially awkward. But he enjoyed reading. He read adventure stories and crime magazines because, you know, he was isolated and at home a lot of the time, which is a normal hobby. But later on, when you look at this through the lens of his isolation and what he was consuming, people wonder if this could also have had an effect on him. His brother Henry, by contrast, was slightly more socially adept, and he maintained private relationships away from the scrutiny of his mum. He managed to keep some things private and secret away from her, whereas Ed didn't seem to have this ability. He was more of a mummy's boy, I guess you would say. He never really thought to try and have relationships away from his mum and keep secrets, whereas his older brother did do that. In 1940, George Gein, Edward's father, died from heart failure after battling with alcoholism for many years. But to be honest, this didn't seem to have an awful lot of impact on Edward or Henry, because Augusta was the dominant parent in the family, and George, you know, he was an alcoholic and just kind of never stood up to Augusta and her behaviour, her abusive behaviour, because she was abusive towards her husband as well, belittling. I often wonder what he ever really saw in Augusta, and maybe this was some kind of arranged situation. Maybe, you know, it was those sorts of times where maybe you had less choice about who you were with, and perhaps your parents had a bit more influence in those sorts of things. So I don't know if that's true. That's just my own thoughts. Then in 1944, May 16th, Henry died in a brush fire near the farm. He went to help fight the fire and he never came back out. Later his body was found and the cause of death was given as asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. Although Ed's account of what happened was a bit inconsistent, and so later on, after everything else comes to light, there are suspicions whether Ed had something to do with his brother's death, but no charges were ever filed against him for his brother, and we will never really know the truth of what happened when his brother died. Then in 1945, when Ed is now 39 years old, and he still is very much a mummy's boy, he's never really had a girlfriend, many friends, he's always been socially isolated and awkward. His mother suffers a series of strokes and he becomes her main caregiver at home. It's just the two of them. So he's taking care of his mum, and even though he's the only person she has to take care of her, she still treats him exactly the same way she always has, belittles him, constantly reminds him of the sins of the world and how women are terrible, and not to trust anybody, and to just not develop his own life. A few months later, Augusta would pass away, and Edward was absolutely devastated by the loss of his mother. She was his entire world. He worshipped the ground she walked on. He did everything she said. He wanted to be a good boy. That's how it seems. I know he's a man at this point, but the mentality is almost like, I need to be a good boy for my mum. I need to do everything she tells me and just be good. So the loss of his mum really was a turning point for Edward and his mental health. He just seriously declined psychologically. I think it's possible to say that he experienced perhaps either a psychotic break or perhaps the onset of schizophrenia was happening, because his actions now become extremely bizarre and terrifying. After his mother's death, he sealed off her bedroom. He also sealed off his brother's bedroom and preserved them exactly as they were left before they died. He didn't touch anything, he didn't move anything. They almost were like shrines or temples to his mum and his brother. And then eventually something happened in Ed where he got it into his mind that he needed to exhume his mother's body and to have her close to him again. So he goes to her graveyard and attempts to do so, but I think it was encased in a lot of cement around it, and so he couldn't actually get to her. So instead of his mum, he exhumed another body from a different grave and convinced himself that this was his mother and took it home with him. Very clearly breaking away from reality and just not able to cope with the loss of his mother, he has just convinced himself, or maybe, as I said, maybe something like schizophrenia has convinced him that this body is now his mum and she's coming back to live with him at the house. So he takes it home and kind of acts as if his mum is still around, sitting her in her favourite chair, talking to her. Very odd. On December 8th, 1954, the owner of a local tavern, Mary Hogan, who was 60 years old at the time, disappeared. When authorities realised she was missing and went to the tavern to look around, there was blood smeared on the floor and throughout the tavern, which they assume is Mary's blood, but her body was never found, and they had no leads to go on. No one knew anything. You know, everyone that saw her last said she was fine. They didn't know anybody that she'd had an altercation with, so there was nothing really to suggest anyone in her disappearance. So nothing really came of trying to find her for a good few years. Then on November 16th, 1957, Bernice Warden, who was the owner of a local hardware store and was 58 years old, also disappeared. When authorities went to the hardware store to check it out, there was a receipt on the counter with Ed Gein's name on it. So this is 3 years since the disappearance of Mary Hogan, and now they have a receipt with Ed Gein's name on it, kind of indicating that he was the last person in the store and to see Bernice. So naturally, they went to question Ed at his farm. Frank Warden, who was the son of Bernice, said he had been long suspicious of Ed Gein's behaviour. He thought he was very strange, a bit odd, but I think most people did. I think people thought he was nice and polite, but very odd. So, upon going to Ed's farm, this is where things come to light. They go into Ed's house, and as they walk in, it's dark, dusty, and just absolutely covered with things. Just mess everywhere, trash, just furniture everywhere, like nothing was orderly or nicely kept. find some very, very odd and disturbing items. There were 10 human skulls that had the tops of them removed and looked like they were being used as bowls to eat out of. There were bones that looked like they'd been carved into cutlery. As they went into the kitchen, there was a pot boiling on the stove, and when they got closer to it, inside was a human heart. We don't know if Ed ate any of these human parts. I think he's always denied that, but I mean, what are you doing boiling a heart? I don't know. There were chairs that had been reupholstered with human skin, some of them having nipples still on them. Also, lampshades, again upholstered with human skin. There were masks on the walls, actual human faces that have been skinned off of a body and hung up like a decoration on the wall. There was a belt, again made of human skin and nipples. The entire house was just a weird... He had reupholstered the house in human skin everywhere. Very strange. And then they go to the barn, and this is where they find Bernice Warden's body. I think it was in the barn, or maybe it was either the barn or the kitchen. I actually can't remember. But they end up finding Bernice Warden's decapitated body hanging upside down, and it was cut from the sternum, maybe slightly higher, the neck or the sternum, all the way down to the pubic area, and just open. The body just open, and the insides not there anymore. They were in the kitchen. That was maybe her heart in the stove, I'm not sure. But there were bags of intestines just kind of sat in the kitchen. There was just organs and human remains everywhere. There was a box of dried vulvas, multiple, I don't even know how many, multiple vulvas in a box. I mean, I don't even... This is just the wildest behaviour. You can see now where the Leatherface inspiration comes from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You know, these skinned faces, and they look like they'd been made into masks that he would possibly put on and wear. And it actually was ended up confirmed that he was trying to make a human suit, so he made trousers, a top and a mask, all out of human remains and human skin, that he wanted to wear. And I think it was to try and become his mum, because he missed her so much that he was attempting to get close to his mum. And I mean, this is some crazy way to do that, but that was apparently what was going on in his head, that he needed to create a woman's skin suit to put on himself to feel closer to his mum. It was just an absolutely horrific scene. There was evidence of so many grave exhumations. There were so many bodies, so many remains in this house. It was like a graveyard in his house, except for it was on everything. Ed was 1947, and it was during the interviews with him that he confessed to wanting to create a woman suit to assume the identity of his mother. And his actions were later described as possibly occurring during dissociative episodes because he would claim that he couldn't remember certain things. But he did confess to killing both Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden, and he would get sentenced for these two murders. But he said that all the other bodies were from grave robbing, essentially, which he was also charged with. But he was deemed legally insane and committed to Central State Hospital. After 11 years of being in the Central State Hospital because he was deemed insane, in November of 1968, Ed was declared competent to stand trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder for Bernice Warden. He was sentenced to life in a mental health institution instead of prison due to his documented mental illness. So he went back to Central State Hospital and at some point moved to Mendota Mental Health Institute and would die there on July 26th of 1984 from respiratory failure at age 77. Before Mary and Bernice were murdered, between the years of 1947 and 1953, there were several disappearances in Plainfield and nearby. Those of Georgia Jean Weckler, who was only 8 years old and vanished on her way to school on May 1st, 1947. Victor Travis and Ray Burgess, two middle-aged men, disappeared after leaving a bar on June 17th, 1952, and Evelyn Hartley, who was only 15, disappeared while she was babysitting in 1953. These are all unsolved disappearances, but some have speculated that maybe Ed may have been involved with these disappearances, considering it was a small town. And, you know, when it was found that he had murdered Mary and Bernice, and it did seem like he was having psychotic breaks and dissociative episodes, that maybe he did do other things that he can't remember, either conveniently can't or genuinely can't, from some kind of psychotic break with reality. So these disappearances never got solved. No one ever knows what happened to them, and yeah, there's a lot of speculation to say that maybe Ed was involved. People thought he might have been involved with the death of his brother, as I mentioned earlier, but again, there was no concrete evidence to suggest that he was involved, but a lot of people do speculate that it could have been him. Criminologists and psychologists studied Ed's life as an example of childhood trauma, social isolation, mental illness, paraphilic behaviours, and severe psychological disturbance, because that's something I forgot to mention actually, is that it was said by Ed that he would use some of the bodies for sexual gratification, but when asked if he did anything necrophiliac, like, he denied having full-on relations with bodies. But who knows what happened? I mean, what else could you use them for sexual gratification? I don't even want to think about that. So that could possibly have been happening. Cannibalism could have been happening. There's so many unknown things with this case because of his severe mental state. Everything about this story is just disturbing. I think this just shocked America at the time. It was just absolutely barbaric and still is to this day. But something that I wonder when it comes to Ed Gein is if there's any possibility that he was neurodivergent, perhaps on the autistic spectrum. And the reason I say this is because people point out that yes, even though he had a terrible childhood and, you know, extreme isolation, being bullied, being put down and abused by his mum, having an alcoholic dad, his brother didn't turn out the same. mother, but Ed didn't seem to be able to, and it just makes me wonder if he had some kind of neurodivergency, because it almost seems like he was perhaps naturally socially inept, as well as the social isolation making it worse. But also it seems as if, and this is just how he's portrayed, who knows, I'm just speculating, but he seemed to be a stickler for following the rules of his mum. Like, he had to do what his mum told him to do, and just never kind of questioning what his mum tells him. And yeah, it makes me wonder if there was something going on there. Which, if that's the case, I actually feel quite sorry for him, because with a mother like his, it's almost like he never stood a chance. He would not know any better in that instance if he was autistic. And it was never diagnosed back then, you know, mental health and all these neurodivergencies that we understand these days just were not understood or even known about in early 1900s. Not a chance. And I just do wonder, by the things that are said about him and the way he's portrayed in the Netflix series, is that maybe he had some kind of inhibited development. But yeah, I just have my suspicions that that might possibly have been happening in Ed's case, because his brother just did not turn out the same. So it's either that, or, as they suggest, he could have been schizophrenic, had some psychotic episodes, and that was the case, or he's just a maniac, you know, a complete psychopath. So that is the case of Edward Gein and his house of horrors. I cannot imagine walking into a house. The smell must have been putrid. And then to go up close to things and realise that they're all human remains, and that he's eating out of skulls. Oh, I just cannot imagine that. Someone living alone like this, you're so out of touch with reality. It's just completely insane, because, you know, to see someone just lose a sense of reality like that is very scary. That this can happen to somebody, you know, through all kinds of circumstances. Obviously his environment, his mother, the treatment of him, but as I said, if he's already got something mentally not quite stable or a bit different, to reach this level of delusion is a scary thought. To want to fill your house with remains of others that are dead, that you've dug up, rather than go and hang out with alive people. I just can't wrap my head around it, and I don't think anybody ever really could, but that is why I question if there was a neurodivergency happening in some form that wasn't understood back then. It could have been that Henry might have been closer with his dad than his mum, and so was able to get away from her influence more. It could have been, this is another thought I had, that maybe Ed was actually favoured by Augusta, and so maybe she targeted him more with indoctrinating him with her beliefs, because she really believed what she was saying, and so maybe that was her way of showing favouritism, by like drumming it into her favourite child. Do you know what I mean? Like creating what she thinks is a perfect boy, man. So maybe he was the favourite and that was her warped way of showing it. I don't know, but I would love to hear your theories about this down below. Sorry this wasn't as structured as my other true crime videos. I kind of rambled with this one and went off into my own tangents, but it really does make you think, this one. But I hope you enjoyed this story.